Good afternoon. I will now call this meeting on social development to order. My name is Caitlin Cleveland and I am the MLA for Cam Lake, and I am also the chair for the Standing Committee on Social Development. To get us started today, I would like to give members in attendance the opportunity to introduce themselves for the record, starting with the member to my left.
Ron Bonatush, Techo.
Katrina Knockleby, Great Slave.
Kevin O'Reilly, Frame Link.
Lisa Semler, MLA for Nuvik Twin Lakes.
Thank you very much, colleagues. Today we are currently here to do a public hearing on Bill 81, an act to amend the Education Act number 2. The GNWT has identified that the Education Act will be amended in 2 phases. Bill 81 represents Phase 1 amendments. This bill proposes limited changes which are technical and administrative in nature. Bill 81 is before Standing Committee to review and report back to the House. As part of Committee's review of Bill 81, we are holding public hearing, which is being live streamed on all Legislative Assembly channels. Committee is seeking residents' input to ensure the voices of Northerners are heard, and Committee welcomes written submissions by June 9th, 2023. With that, I would like to pass the floor over to the Minister for opening remarks, and I'd like to ask you to please start by introducing your staff for the record. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair. With me today on my left, I have John McDonald, the Deputy Minister of Education, Culture and Employment, and to my right, Sam Shannon, the Assistant Deputy Minister of Corporate Services, and next to him is Shannon Barnett-Aikman, Assistant Deputy Minister of Education and Culture. Education, Culture and Employment is proposing amendments to the Education Act that support the priority of the 19th Legislative Assembly to increase student education outcomes to the same level as the rest of Canada. Bill 81 represents the first phase of amendments that make operational and technical improvements designed to improve the education system. The second phase will continue beyond the 19th Assembly to allow for more in-depth discussions with Indigenous governments, education bodies, and the public on the future of education governance in the Northwest Territories. Amendments proposed by Bill 81 serve to recognize the vital role Indigenous peoples and Indigenous governments have in education, eliminate confusion about roles and responsibilities of the minister and education bodies, protect parental involvement in decisions around student grade placement and education program modifications, mandate the provision of student transportation, and support information sharing and accountability. These amendments to help address the findings and recommendations of internal evaluations and reports of the Office of the Auditor General of Canada. This legislative initiative was informed by extensive public engagement that occurred in 2021, as well as detailed engagement sessions with education bodies towards the development of a legislative proposal and drafting instructions for a bill in 22-23. This concludes my opening remarks, and we'd be pleased to answer any questions committee may have. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Minister. Committee, I'd like to take this opportunity to open it up to the floor for any questions that committee members might have in regards to this bill. Emily Knockleby.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I forgive if I'm repeating myself and I've asked you this question in the past, just bear with me. I guess I'm curious around with the busing situation and how much is that really going to end up costing us as a territory. I get the conundrum of, school districts are not necessarily able to afford a lot of things anymore. You tie in the fact that there's one provider who has staffing issues like everywhere else in the territory. And I just worry about enshrining in legislation the right of transportation. And again, I know that kids need to get to school, so I'm not sure what the answer is or what the solution should be, but I'm a little bit concerned about it in this bill. Thank you.
Thank you, Emily Knockleby. Minister?
Thank you, Madam Chair, and that's understandable. The education bodies have raised this with me as well. So there is an understanding at the department that if we are to mandate transportation, that will require additional funding. So I'm saying that here on the record because I do want people to know that that has been the position and will remain the position of the department. It has been difficult to staff certain positions like bus drivers here in the territory. So, this is an issue that has been highlighted across the territory now for the last few years, actually, since I've become minister. There is a requirement in our regulations to work with the education bodies, or in the Act, I believe, to work with the education bodies when we develop regulations. So, although this bill speaks to mandating student transportation, it is subject to those regulations that we are legally required to develop in consultation with the education bodies. Some, just by looking at the wording in the bill, people might think that every community in the territory is going to need a yellow school bus that's going to pick up every child in every community, and that's not the case. In some instances, that you might need a van, you might need a small vehicle, you might only need to transport a small portion of the population, the student population. Maybe some schools want to focus on certain students with certain challenges in getting to school. So there's a number of different ways this can go. It is not just a blanket requirement to transport all students to schools regardless of their situation or where they're from. And the detail of that will be developed in consultation with education bodies. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Minister. Emily Knockleby, do you have a follow-up question?
Yes, and thank you for that. And it is, I think, really important to note it is not for all 33 communities that all of a sudden there'll be a bus around. And I guess that kind of lends me to think sort of outside the box a bit for Yellowknife, where I've had, a conversation with, say, taxi drivers where they're underutilized. And I just kind of wonder, how it's that we have a glut in one area of people driving and a lack in another area. But so I guess more so just besides pondering, my question would be around the cost of this. Do we have any preliminary idea of what amount of money that this is going to end up meaning that the government will have to provide to the education bodies? And I'm a bit concerned too in that government finances are always fairly limited. So I'm wondering if this is going to set up a bit of maybe a bit of a back and forth or a hard conversation with the education bodies if they then become not satisfied with the amount that they're provided. Now they're mandated. So we often see where the government makes people do things and they do provide some funding, but it's never enough maybe to actually meet that new cost. So I guess some questions around that. Thank you.
Thank you, Emily Knockleby. Minister?
Yeah, so we don't know the cost because every situation is going to be different. Right now, I believe it's around $2.2 million that is provided for busing through our funding formula. Of course, that money can be used for anything that education bodies want. There are education bodies who receive busing funding and do not provide any type of student transportation. So without working with the education bodies, we don't know how much this will cost. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister. Emily Bonnet-Rouge.
Merci, Madam Chair. Merci to the Minister and his staff. I note that it says here to protect parental involvement in decisions around student grade placement. I was interested in that one specifically because there was an incident where I was transporting some students to an event. And I asked their grade levels. And they all stood there looking at each other. They didn't know what grade they were in. These are high school students in Providence, my community. So I'm wondering, and I was after, I'm on record for trying to get the actual grade levels of the students in our education systems in the small communities. And you were saying that you don't follow that at all or something like that because you don't have the stats. And nothing's being shared by the education bodies like the district education councils. They won't give me those answers. And it's something that I think it's really important if we're talking about improving student outcomes in the small communities with the rest of Canada. And I think that term pretty well means that about the grade levels, whether we're on par with the rest of, like if a student was to go to Alberta, taking grade 8 and then in WT going to Alberta, and then you find out that, well, you're not at a grade 8 level. And it's happening with our high school students who go down south for post-secondary. They graduate with a grade 12, but they find out they're not actual grade 12. That's why I was always after about, the actual grade levels so that, we're in sync with the rest of Canada. And the education system, as you've been stating, before on the floor that you don't follow that. And I just don't know what the logic is behind all that. I was just wondering if you could explain that and also what it means with this phrase that you're like protect parental involvement and stuff. That's it.
Thank you. Emily Bonnet-Rouge, Minister.
Thank you. So when we talk about parental involvement in this context, it comes out of the conversations that I've often hear where parents are perhaps surprised when their student is not at the grade level where they expected. Maybe they graduate, but they don't have the credits needed to go into post-secondary. And so what this amendment intends to do is ensure that parents are given the opportunity for that involvement. So the way it works in the Northwest Territories is that students are generally placed in grades based on their age. So they have a cohort of students their own age, and they move through the system with those students. If a student needs more work in some area, and maybe they're at a grade 4 level, but they're placed in grade 5, then in grade 5 they would do work to help them, theoretically help them get up to that grade 5 level. This often happens without parents' awareness, and so what we are proposing is to require schools to engage with parents and say, your student or your child is not at a grade, let's say 5 level. And so if we put them into grade 5, this is what would happen. These would be the types of lessons that they would be learning. The other option is to retain them for a year, keep them in, say, grade 4 for another year. Right now, people just see students they think they're just pushed through the system. So this will give parents an opportunity to say, okay, I understand what you want to do with my child, put them in grade 5 and work with them. I appreciate that, and now I know that, so then I can work with them as well, because I have an understanding of where they are. Or parents can say, no, I think my child would benefit from being held back a year. So right now, those conversations, from what I've been told, from what I hear, don't happen as often as they could. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister. Emily Bonnet-Rouge.
Let's see for that. I don't think I had answer to my big part about the actual grade levels compared to the rest of Canada, but what the minister is saying, and the term doesn't come out of his mouth, but we're more about social passing. That's what's happening. When you're saying parents will be met now, I think many of them are going to probably be shocked that, okay, hey, we got social passing system in our education system in the small communities. So that's where it's at there with and then it's going to be challenging for some parents, when they do go to report cards, because it's kind of dismal right now, the stats for parents that actually show up for the student teacher. Anyways, let me just move on from that, since I only had a couple questions here. I'm just wondering what the relationship ECE has with the Northwest Territories Teachers Association, since they represent all teachers and including from the small communities too. Regarding new initiatives that the ECE has, especially with these changes too, and also the curriculum change to BC. I'm just wondering what that is like. Let's see.
Thank you, Emily Bonnet-Rouge. Minister.
Thank you. I'm happy to say that ECE has a very good relationship with the NWT Teachers Association. Not every jurisdiction in Canada, probably we're in the minority in Canada because we have such a good relationship. It's not normal. So I can say that, and we do understand that the teachers are the ones who have to carry out these new initiatives, and so there is a lot of reaching out to and working with the education or the Teachers Association. I can ask Mr. McDonald through you, Madam Chair, to speak more to this. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister. Deputy Minister.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And the Minister is correct. We do have a good working relationship with the Teachers Association. There's a collective bargaining relationship. There is a type of relationship where, for example, if ECE is looking to communicate information about an initiative, we can request the association to communicate that to their members because they have member email accounts. So it allows us sometimes to more directly really reach the teacher population. As we develop new initiatives, new project ideas, we, by definition, approached the association early on in the planning to provide opportunities for them to have input. We periodically invite them to meetings that we have with education body superintendents or meetings that the minister may have with education leaders, the chairpersons of the education bodies. So it is an ongoing dynamic relationship, but generally it is quite good, and we've been able to ensure that teacher voice and input is considered when we are developing initiatives. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you very much. Next on my list, I have Emily Semler.
Thank you. Sorry, I just gotta get back to my notes here. So in the one that I wanted to highlight was the clarifying of roles, responsibilities amongst education bodies. And I don't think it's just among education bodies. I think that, and if I go down further, it's the one, and I'll use the example, is when I was on the DEA, even with hiring, under the Act and the regs, you know, it does state within the in the district education, so Inuvik district education regs, that they're involved with hiring and, you know, and then you go to the regional and then they're involved in the hiring and then, but then at one point it is depending on who the superintendent is. And then what happened was, is that as a member, there were other members when I got onto the board that they were always involved in deciding as a council of their complement with their principal of where their teachers, you know, and what programs and how they were going to, you know, have, and then all of a sudden, and the chair was always involved in the interviewing and the processes, right? And then all of a sudden down the road, we changed within EC&E and direction, and it was like, no, that's taken away from the local authorities, and it's the staff, like the superintendent, that are dealing with it, and just with the principal, and the DAs are not. So there's this, and it depends on who's interpreting, I think, and so there's a lot of, and when you get on the board as a parent to the DEA, you're not, like, that's what I said, I'll admit, that was the first time I ever started reading legislation. And now I'm here today. So, you know, and I think that's so important in legislation, that these roles are clear. And so, I'm glad to hear that you guys are doing this because there's some things that the community wants to be involved in, and is what programming and the cultural programming and, and bringing those concerns at the community level. And then the regional board, your chairs are dealing about how our education is in, and we're working directly with the superintendent and all of the specialized staff and I can only speak to Beaufort Delta, but it's an important relationship, but everybody needs to know what, and so can you explain to me if this is going to really finalize this discrepancy of who does what? Because then you got elected people that are being, sometimes the staff are then saying, well, EC&E is telling us we can't do that, and then so you guys can't make that decision. And then I become an MLA and I go to the minister and I'm like, and he's like, but I can't tell boards what to do. So I'm like, so we can't make direction when I was on the board, and now I'm hearing that you can't tell boards what to do. So can you clarify and make sure that this is all clear in this new legislation?
Thank you, Emily Semler. Minister?
Thank you. So I think the MLA laid out the reason that we want to advance these amendments very well. So there's confusion right from the ministerial level down to the DEA level. So what we're proposing is to consolidate all of the minister's direction-making authority, I guess, in the Act. Because right now it's scattered throughout the Act, and in the past ministers have given direction to education bodies that probably weren't legally allowed to make. So we want to clarify that so everyone knows what the minister can and can't do. And then once you get down to the regions where there are DECs as well as DEAs, so the District Education Council are the regional body, and then the DEAs are the local bodies. The Education Act and the regulations provides both of those bodies a number of overlapping authorities. And whose authority, who's responsible for what has never really been articulated in a number of DEC and DEA relationships. So what we are trying to do is not enforce anything, but ask the bodies to put their minds to these issues and say, so if there is this circumstance, who is responsible? Because if everyone is responsible, then no one's responsible. And we run, I think, if you've been in education, you run into these issues. And so, I didn't want to take a heavy-handed approach and say you must define roles, or if you don't define them, I'll define them for you. So it really is voluntary, but we are enshrining in legislation that we're there to help. So if education bodies amongst themselves can't determine what authorities should be delegated to the DEC and the DEA, then they can come to the department and we can help work through mediate those circumstances. So, it won't eliminate all confusion, because there will be bodies, I'm sure, that won't, won't make this clarification, but we are really pushing for it to happen. Thank you.
Minister, Emily Semler.
Just to follow up to that, I guess is my concern would be is when I was on the board, we were a board that was very involved, and if that authority was given to us, we were acting on that authority according to the regs, and then some communities were not. So with the direction that the new superintendent come in, it was like, well, we don't do this here, so we're not doing it here. And it's like, but we've always done to the max of what we were able to do as a board, and maybe some of the communities don't have the capacity to do what we were doing in the regional center, and like Yellowknife, maybe the capacity is even at a higher level. So I guess that would be my concern, is we don't want to take, if there is an authority that like for a regional center like Inuvik, which has a way bigger involvement, and then you look at Fort Smith or Hay River, that they still are, but if they're not able to do what they should be able to say, and it should be clear direction, because that's what we were as a board saying is, no, we want to continue to do this, but we were like taken away from us. So if it needs to be clear. It needs to be clear that we should have to give up that authority if it says in the regs that we can do it.
Thank you, Ms. Semler.
Thank you. And so I don't believe we intend on putting this in the regulations. This would be, we would want written policies. They could be part of our accountability framework that education bodies produce every year, and then we consolidate and we table in the House here. But if a DEA in Inuvik wants to continue doing what it's doing, and that's different from what the DEA in Tuck wants to do, if they want different authorities, that can happen. So the DEC and the DEAs just have to figure that out. And what we found is there are smaller DEAs who don't have the capacity, and they might not realize that, or the DEC might not realize that they can actually reach out and help them build that capacity. So at least putting these education bodies' minds to it, they'll be aware of what their capacity is and what issues they have, and ways that they maybe even work better together. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister. Next on my list, I have Emily O'Reilly.
Thanks, Madam Chair. So I think it's fair to say that there were some concerns expressed over even these limited amendments that are being proposed here. This is like phase 1. Phase 2 is to be a larger review of the Education Act, but I think there was some concerns from Indigenous governments about they wanted to be kind of at the drafting table on phase 1. Maybe you can just describe for me where the department is at with phase 2 and what relationships have been developed with Indigenous governments for phase 2. Thanks, Madam Chair.
Very much, Emily O'Reilly. Minister?
Thank you. So what we are proposing is to work through the NWT Council of Leaders and develop an MOU, and then work collaboratively with those Indigenous governments to develop the Education Act and then the regulations. And that's a long-term project. I'm guessing it's going to take multiple governments. It won't happen in the next assembly. I can't imagine. So that right now the focus has been on these amendments. I don't believe the MOU work has started yet, but perhaps I can hand it to the Deputy Minister for a discussion of that and any other relevant information. Thank you.
Minister, Deputy Minister?
Thank you, Madam Chair. The Minister is correct. That approach has already started. EC has presented to the Council of Leaders Secretariat, so officials within the representative Indigenous governments and organizations. So we've proposed that we resume work on developing an MOU and getting this new legislative initiative underway. That proposal has been accepted. There's interest in that. So we're soon to be looking to start to schedule preliminary meetings to develop that MOU and get ourselves into a position where we can get that work underway. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you very much, Deputy Minister. Emily O'Reilly.
Yeah, no, thanks. Yeah, that sounds good to me, and I personally didn't really have any difficulty with the Phase 1 items that are contained in this bill, because I think they're also largely in response to the Auditor General's recommendations. So, yeah, I have no objections to what's in this bill. Thanks.
Emily O'Reilly, Minister, do you care to comment?
Appreciate the comments. Thank you.
Minister, I'll pass the floor back to Emily Semler.
Chair, the part in the statement where you're establishing authority for sharing information on student records and student achievement, I know between education bodies and EC&E through a territorial-wide systems and processes. So I know right now each authority, education authority, is independent, and so like BDEC for the Beaufort Delta, and then we had the Auditor General report that says we're not doing this very well, that we're not being able to achieve see student achievement across the territory, and so that my question comes is how does the government, with this change, is great, because then we could actually really see where our kids, and I know that we did a lot of work in the Beaufort Delta prior to when I was still there, on data collection, and they started, and I think I've mentioned this before, is they started it in math, and then they had these common math assessments and that were developed, and that every class and every grade had to do the same exam after each module, and they were able to collect where the kids were in math at a better, but their concern was that they weren't getting enough time to be able to teach the content with all of the days missed and student absences. So this is a bigger issue. I mean, I can go down that wormhole, but how, like, is there, I know this is just in the legislative part, but as a department, how are we going to be able to do this when every authority creates their curriculum and does their testing differently? Is there going to be an NWT? Like, I mean, when I was in school, it was a long time ago, but we used to have like certain grades where we did these achievement tests, and there were national tests, and we never met the national rate. We never met the Alberta rate, and the kids in the region don't meet Yellowknife's rate. And the kids in the communities are not even coming close to like what Yellowknife or the regions are. So I'm just wondering, first I'll leave that as how you're going to, like, what's the process with that?
Thank you very much, Emily Semler, Minister.
Thank you. So right now, information sharing is difficult. There's not the legislative authority for, say, the superintendents, who are the primary contacts for the department, to share a lot of information. And so when schools are doing, administering their own tests and things like that, that information is often not available to the department, so we don't get that territory-wide snapshot. We do get information on, obviously, graduation rates, the Alberta achievement tests, the member reference, diploma exams, things like that, but there's a lot more that's happening out there. We are looking, and it will be difficult because, you have to compare apples to apples. And if there's these different assessments out there, it's hard to compare them. But we are looking at things like an NWT-wide report card. Perhaps I can hand it to the Deputy Minister for some more information on this. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister. Deputy Minister.
Thank you, Madam Chair. The Minister is correct that because each individual education body has legal control and responsibility for student data within their area, it does create complexities and a lot of inefficiency when we're trying to collect data, report on, and analyze it and report on it, and really, at the end of the day, use it to inform better decision-making or where we put resources. One example where that inefficiency has plagued us is new information systems to support student learning. We, a number of years ago, tried to work collaboratively with all of the education bodies to introduce a new planning tool for students to use where they would enter their own data. And it became extremely complicated, it became extremely expensive. It took many more years to work that out because of all of those complexities. So what we're envisioning is allow it, once this bill would be come into force, it would allow us to work with the education bodies on student record regulations to allow that data to be passed more easily from entity to entity within the system, and thus respond to the OAG audit criticisms about our lack of ability to report effectively and to hold everyone in the system accountable. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you very much, Deputy Minister. Emily Sumler, do you have a follow-up?
Yeah, I guess I'll just, more of a comment. It's, knowing how hard it is even to just try to get through within the communities and in one region and sharing that information and trying to come up with the data on just one area. I say good luck but I think it's very important that we do start to find ways that I could sit here and talk about the grade levels in Inuvik and where and what the achievements that they have that they don't meet and they don't par up with with Yellowknife. But my biggest concern is we need to be able to meet this territorial wide and where I see the biggest concern is, in our small communities. And I'm going to say this, it doesn't really have anything to do with this, but I'll put it out on the record is, and I work in nursing for my entire career before coming into the Legislative Assembly. And we do not send new grads out to the community because they're just not experienced enough to deal with the issues alone in those communities. But in the education system, that is where we're sending out our new grads out of university into our communities and to staff with some of our communities that have the less services, the low grade rates, the low attendance, a lot of trauma, and not a lot of support. And so I think that I'm going to put this out here now is in order to change anything, we have to start looking at the way that we're sending out and who's teaching in our communities. Thank you.
Thank you, Emily Sumler. Minister?
Thank you, and I know it's beyond the scope of this bill, but the biggest impact on a student's outcomes is the quality of the teachers, and so small communities often get the students who are straight out of school, who might be there only for a couple of years and then they move on and then someone else new comes in. So, we are very live to that. We do our best to attract teachers to the territory. We have, probably the most generous compensation package for teachers in the country. And so we're thankful to get at least new teachers, but yeah, it would be ideal to have more experienced teachers. If we had experienced teachers in all the communities, we'd be having a different conversation right now. So, thank you.
Next on my list, I have Emily Bonnet-Rouge.
Madam Chair, there's a term here that you're going to consult with Indigenous governments, and you've mentioned the NWT Council of Leaders. I'm wondering if what ECE brings to that table, like in terms of stats. I'm wondering if ECE paints the picture of the education system in the small communities for them, and the problems we're having with graduation rates and the problems we're having with social passing, and the problems we're having further, the students gaining further education such as universities and two-year engineering programs. Because the big picture here is that we're looking at the Polytech University for the NWT. So I'm wondering if you go to that table to really paint that picture to them, because a lot of times that information is kind of hidden from everybody. Even up to this date right now, the regional First Nations bodies do not know what is really happening. So they're not addressing education because nobody ever goes in front of them to address the education, the problems with the education. You know, we don't see that big picture around there. We don't see it in the local picture either. I'm just wondering what you would be bringing and whether you would be letting them know of the situation with the education in the small communities. Merci.
Thank you, Emily Bonnet Rouge. Minister?
Thank you. So yeah, part of that process is going to have to be orienting the Indigenous government officials and leaders to the situation. But I have a feeling that most people know what's going on in their communities with education. We do release annually a report that highlights the graduation rates in small communities versus regional centers versus Yellowknife. We do release those accountability framework reports where education bodies discuss the initiatives that are happening in their communities, how many, what type of training teachers are taking, what type of training the DEAs are taking, and various other aspects of it. So there is information out there. But if we're going to develop this legislation in consultation with Indigenous governments in Phase 2, then yes, there will absolutely, we'll need to provide information. Thank you.
Minister, Emily Bonnet Rouge, do you have a follow-up question?
Yes. To Madam Chair. So I'm wondering if we have those discussions with the Indigenous leaders at any table, whether it be regional or at the territorial level, whether, because, we all know education is failing, drastically in the small communities. And I'm wondering, because of the university coming up, and I've said before that, we're going to probably have half empty halls or half full halls, and there's not going to be anybody from the small communities currently. So I'm wondering if education is going to go to any table with Indigenous governments with a mindset of how to improve education in the small communities, to advance our Indigenous students to higher education. Merci.
Thank you very much, Emily Bonnet Rouge, and I know that that's expanding kind of the scope of the conversation here today, but and is probably a very big conversation. But Minister, if I can pass back to you for a brief response. Thank you.
Thank you. And I know the member is more of a hall half empty kind of guy. I think I'm more of a hall half full kind of guy. I'm a little more optimistic, I think, about the future of education in the territory, because we are making changes right across the board. And we are working with Indigenous governments. I met with the Lidley First Nation a couple weeks ago. I've had a number of discussions at the bilateral meetings that Cabinet holds with Indigenous governments. I've discussed this at the Council of Leaders with all of the Indigenous governments from around the territory. And as we move forward with the Education Act, the modernization in the next assembly, that is going to be focused on how to improve student outcomes and what role Indigenous governments are going to take in education. So, it is a very collaborative future that we are looking ahead to. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister. Emily Bonnet Rouge, do you have a follow-up?
You're not allowing him to answer any questions, so I got no further.
You can absolutely ask the question. I just want to try and keep the scope on the bill. And education is a very important one, and I know one that's passionate for yourself. But these might be questions that are better continued on the floor of the House, just cognizant of time before session here. Members, does anybody else have any additional questions at this time in regards to the bill? Okay. Minister, I have one quick question for you in regards to information sharing. And I do want to point to your opening remarks that do address that the increase in information sharing between yourself and school boards are a direct result of recommendations from the OAG report. But when we hear about information sharing, we go straight to reporting and the administrative requirements of that. So I'm wondering if you can speak to what supports will be provided in order for school boards to be able to accomplish that expectation. Thank you.
Thank you. And this is where, you look at economies of scale and the fact that we have the Department of ECE to assist with these types of initiatives that cover the entire education system. So there's definitely an awareness that we don't want to just burden the education bodies with more administrative work. There's no question there will be some more administrative work, at least at the front end. But as the Deputy Minister talked about information systems, we want to streamline it and make it easier in the long run. So perhaps the Deputy Minister can flesh out this conversation. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Much, Minister, Deputy Minister.
Thank you, Madam Chair. As the Minister said, we're very aware that we want to avoid placing additional administrative burden on the backs of school staff or DEC staff. This is work that once the regulations are in place and we're more aware of specific indicators or data that we want to be able to access, work on system level data can be collected through new information systems that ECE would be procuring on behalf of the whole system. So that would be something that we would lead and try to the degree possible minimize the impact on education partners. There's also classroom level data and student level reporting, and those changes are already underway with the BC curriculum transition, where we have staff working with education body staff to look at, as the Minister said, a future where we have territorial-wide reporting for students that's consistent and again saves work for school staff. So this is all related and allows us to be able to ultimately reduce the workload on where it's needed most. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you very much, Deputy Minister. Members, are there any additional questions for the Minister at this time? With that, I'd like to say thank you very much to the Minister and the team from Education, Culture and Employment for joining us here today. Members, we do have someone else who would like to do a presentation to committee today, and that would be David Wasilsu. Oh, sorry. David Wasilsu, who is the chair of the Board of Trustees for the Yellowknife Education District Number 1. And Mr. Wasilsu is on the line and ready to present to committee, and so I will pass the floor over to him.
I'm going to turn everything back on. Can you hear me okay?
I can hear you. The floor is yours.
Perfect. I couldn't turn on the video again, but I could turn on the mic. Thank you very much, Chairperson. I just had a few brief comments. I know you guys have sessions starting soon, and just wanted to raise a few issues that we've discussed at YK1 regarding the amendments to the Education Act. The biggest thing that we discussed, as a few of you mentioned earlier, was to do with busing and transportation, and the movement of transportation from a service that school boards or DAs, DECs may provide to something that the minister can put into regs as something we will have to do, we shall do, and that's a big concern to us. Simply in that we already, as many of you know, here in Yellowknife, there's been a lot of problems this year offering transportation services to students. Just bus driver availability, the whole thing. And right now, even in Yellowknife, we have the other districts that have busing programs currently. And the further concern to that, of course, is having provided to all students. So right now, we provide it to many students, but certainly not all. And the concerns there, of course, is simply that the cost would escalate quite a bit more. I think already our district pays something like $600,000 or $700,000 a year in busing. If we were talking everybody and JK students, I know earlier in the meeting, the minister mentioned had no idea, but a couple of $1 million figure, or that's how much they spend on transportation currently. Our estimates for what it would cost us to actually transport all of the kids were in that $2 million plus range, just for our district, never mind anywhere else. Obviously, student transportation is very important to us, and making sure students can get to school is of great importance, but it's more than, there's a lot of pieces that fit into that, and our concern is the act changing before there's even really looking at the budget or anything else, and that perhaps these changes the slight change in section 33.4 of Bill 81, perhaps maybe it's just not time for that yet. Maybe once we've stabilized and the funding formula has been sorted out around transportation and how that would work, maybe that would be the time to make an amendment like that. Many of the other amendments in the bill are housekeeping measures, a bit of information sharing. This transportation has significant impacts on, frankly, mostly from a cost side, but also from a logistics standpoint, from a whole bunch of areas. And so there's big implications. It was very good to hear from the minister and the deputy minister earlier that the commitment to working with school boards on that. But at the same time, there's many things underway and many changes happening right now. And I guess our big question is are these changes contemplated in that one section of this act? Is this the right time for that? There's enough other things happening and a lot of other money being invested in the system and being done that perhaps this is one extra thing that just things aren't quite ready for yet. One other piece to mention, and not directly related to students, but to boards and board elections, was the inclusion of allowing for mail-in balloting, which we just wanted to say is really good to see in this last election in Yellowknife. I know the election authorities for the education districts were dismayed to find out that while it was allowed under the municipal, like the Local Elections Act, the School Board Act didn't actually allow that. So that was obviously frustrating at the time. So seeing this just brings the two acts into line. But one thing, one general comment to that is while this adds mail-in balloting, it might be easier if the Education Act simply referenced methods of election allowed under the Local Authorities Act. Because if there are any changes to the Local Authorities Act and Local Elections Act in the future, they're going to have to also go back and change the Education Act again. It seems a little inefficient, and since the change is already being made, perhaps a more general change tying the styles of election between the two types that happen at the same time in most communities would make the most sense for the territory, rather than having to make future amendments. So that was the main thing I wanted to speak to you today about was with regards to busing. One comment, just by virtue of speaking after the minister's comments. The conversation about information sharing today was very interesting, and I appreciate the questions the committee was asking the minister. Those are a big concern to us as well, and hearing new reporting requirements is a big concern, and sort of the administrative burden around that really comes up, and funding, understanding that the department has its own capacity constraints, never mind the constraints that all of the DEAs and DECs experience. That really is an issue. And I know long-term, we'd like to see more information and more reporting and all kinds of stuff. All the things the minister would like to see, the board would like to see too. And, there's these kinds of things would be great. But the more that we create, it does take a lot of administrative time. In some cases from teachers, in some cases from school staff, and other cases from district admin. So being cognizant of that and limiting it, but also where necessary or possible, providing funding to actually be able to do that is really important. And to that, one of the comments was regarding superintendent sharing information. And I do also want to just emphasize that the information and reporting really should go through DEAs, DECs. We have these sort of elected bodies for a reason, and the information that flows up sort of should be through those bodies, not just directly with staff and the GNWT, just to make sure that there is that local input into the education system. We have fairly a significant style of education governance in the territory and in most of Canada, but making sure that that information is sharing through those bodies and back rather than just directly, I think also helps with that division of duties that a few of the MLAs were speaking about earlier. Where that line gets blurry is where things go directly and skip through, or the path isn't quite clear. So making sure that stays there. And I think, thank MLAs for the questions about trying to clarify those duties and how that works. So I just wanted to share those comments from YK1.
Thank you so much, and we really appreciate you taking the time today over your lunch to come in and speak with committee. So thank you very much for that. Committee members, does anybody have any questions at this time? Okay. So I'd like to say thank you very much on behalf of committee. We understand that you'll also be submitting a written submission as well to committee, which we very much look forward to receiving and having the opportunity to go through. And I'd also like to take this opportunity to let members of the public know that committee is still accepting any written submissions from anyone in the public who would like to have input on this bill, and that input can be sent through a written submission to committees@ntassembly.ca. And if you are unsure how to do that or how to participate, please feel free to contact myself as chair or any member of the committee for sure. Thank you so much. And I see that MLA O'Reilly has a question as well.
Yeah, thanks, Madam Chair. So, in my capacity as an MLA from Yellowknife, I've met with, I don't think I've met with YCS, but I have met with CSF-TNO, Commission Scolaire, the Francophone school board, and I've heard the same concern from them. I would just like to suggest to Mr. Wasilsiu that if this is a common concern from all the Yellowknife-based education authorities, that a joint letter might be a little more helpful, or would, I think, bring forward concerns. So I'll just leave that with Mr. Wasilsiu. Thank you.
Thank you so much, MLA O'Reilly. I also wanted to point out to members of the public as well that committee will be doing some community engagement on this piece of draft legislation as well. And committee will be in Inuvik on June 6th at 5 p.m. at the Midnight Sun Complex. Committee will also be on Wednesday, June 7th in Norman Wells at the Legion at 7 p.m. and on Thursday, June 8th in Delaney at 5 p.m. at the Cultural Center. So again, thank you so much to everyone who joined us today, followed along, and of course yourself, Mr. Wasilsiu, who presented. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the opportunity.